Localization is just about translating words into another local language. That is absolutely not true, and I'm going to talk you through why that is. Hello and welcome to Engage and Thrive, also known as EAT, your coffee catch-up with me, your host, Taelon, where we will go through common problems and hurdles that come up in business, marketing and advertising and try and demystify them. I know firsthand how complicated and confusing it can seem with all the different acronyms and all the things to do in business. So let me try and help you be better in business. First things first, let's start with grabbing a coffee. Localization is often misunderstood and interchangeably used as just translating. But actually what localization means is really your product, your service and your content focused on that local market. So this is emotionally, physically, your images, your tone, your sentiment, the colors, numbers, everything, which will go into in the takeaways. But if you take an example and even think of newspapers, okay, and think of something that is in a national newspaper versus a local newspaper and how localizing it would reference things like local businesses or local people. Now you have to think about that as well in a local market of a different country. If your content is just talking about something quite generic on your brand and not relatable to people locally, then you haven't localized it. There's obviously a reason why the likes of McDonald's and KFC do localized menus, or Apple having localized websites down to the country. So there'll be different products and services that they offer and currency changes, etc. And even if you just think about English speaking countries, so the US, the UK, Australia, South Africa, even just taking those 4 countries as an example and using English, the way you spell things, terminology, the way you phrase things, even that would be different. So even that would need to be localized within English. About 10 years ago, there was a series of adverts produced by HSBC talking about localization really and understanding local markets. And I will link those adverts in the show notes, but they're using the examples of business people doing business in different markets. So there's one where a guy is going to shake hands, another one a guy's bowing, another one where they're sitting having dinner and what it means about finishing your plate versus leaving some food on your plate. That's really understanding localization and local markets. As always, let's go through vocab. And the ones today are going to be quite different to ones we've covered off before. The first one is L10N, which is localization. And this is adapting your content or products or services to local culture and local norms. Translation, converting text from one language to another. Transcreation, so this is recreating content in a localized language, but keeping the same sentiment and tone. TMS, Translation Management System. So there are tools and workflows that you can use to help with your translation of content. Cultural adaptation. So this is when you may need to change some of your content based on local customs or sensitivities, religious beliefs, local practices, things you can and can't say in certain markets. And finally, UX, user experience. So this is typically spoken about when you're talking about a website. So what's the user experience of someone on a website? Which is obviously very important if you're talking about certain markets. If you're going from an English market to Japanese market, Korean market, Arabic market. Number 1, trust through local relevance. So obviously, as I touched on this in the myth busting, localization is more than just translating your content into the local language. It's also understanding locally about customs and ways of living and lifestyle and how people do things. And the more you can do that to be locally sensitive, the more your brand is relatable to local people, because it's really kind of giving them the nod that they can trust you. To give you examples, certain colors and numbers may mean things in certain cultures. So as someone who's been living in Asia for a while, I know that colors have certain meanings, especially in Thai culture. There's certain colors for if you want love or if you want money. And then numbers are really important and synergies around numbers. So 8 is seen as very lucky in a lot of Chinese culture and even some of Asian cultures. And 13, we may joke about it in Western culture being like, oh, unlucky 13. But I mean, there are physical condo buildings, so don't even use the number 13 in the lifts. They will use 12 and then 12A and then 14. Another example of localization is measurements. So there will be certain measurements that may change in different markets. And this may be down to shoe sizes, okay? So we know that there's UK shoe sizing, US shoe sizing, Euro shoe sizing. And then if you think about measurements for clothes, there's European sizing, there's US sizing, there's UK sizing. And I'll give you one even further is Lululemon as a brand actually have a sizing called Asia Fit, which in their leggings are actually shorter leggings because they know the Asian demographic are generally shorter than the Western demographic, which is great for me. Another one with different measurements, if you think of IKEA. So IKEA is in a lot of markets. And actually, if you go to buy bedding in different IKEA stores across the world, the bed sizes are different in different countries. So they can't just supply a double bed being the same size double bed in every market. They are different in different countries. There's also products that you may adapt according to certain markets. So for example, in Asian markets, a lot of products, especially skincare, actually have whitening lotions in because in Asian culture it's seen as prestige or you're richer if you are paler. Whereas in Western culture, we want more suntan lotions and we want bronzing and everything. So actually P&G is a prime example with a lot of their products that they sell have different ingredients in different markets. Another one that's also quite funny is terms of like names of products too. So in the UK, you'll know a product called Lynx. In the US, it's actually called Axe. I don't know why, but there are different names for different markets. And then again, if you think about like hospitality, they may use different ingredients based on local produce or local palates and flavors and tastes. So if you think of KFC, as I mentioned, McDonald's, Starbucks, all the menus will differ slightly for each of those markets. Another thing to think about is payment methods. So payment methods may vary in different markets. Again, to use Asia as an example, card acceptance is completely different to the Western world. So I think the Western world we're quite familiar with Apple Pay and pay on card for everything. And Asian markets are quite familiar with using cash. And post-COVID, there's a lot more around QR codes. So you actually scan and use a QR code to pay. But another payment method that's actually huge is WeChat, which in the Western world, that doesn't even really exist. But again, if you're going into local markets, you need to be able to accept those local payments. Otherwise, you could end up having a market that can't pay for your product or service. Social platforms, again, they vary by market. Depending on what market you're going to, depends on the uptake of those platforms. So the likes of Facebook, Instagram, we know are quite popular worldwide, right? But actually, when you go down into each market, what's the usage of those platforms? For example, Snapchat is really, really popular in the Middle East. And then in Asia, as I keep using as an example, there is actually a chat app called Line, so equivalent of like WhatsApp, but you can actually also like upload photos and people can buy things within the app, and it's kind of an all-in-one platform. But then if you're thinking about going into the US, you may want to do a lot more on Facebook and not so much on TikTok based on what's happening at the moment where they may no longer have TikTok. Another thing to think about is voiceovers. So if you're doing any video content or supplying a product or service or an app or anything that has the ability of a voice, so if you think of Google Maps, Apple Maps, Amazon Alexa, those voiceovers available. If it's not in a local accent, firstly, people may struggle to understand it because it's not natively what they're used to. And secondly, it may not be as relatable. They want to be able to hear someone that sounds like them or an accent that they're familiar with. The other thing to think about with accents as well is what may be seen as a more prestigious accent. So even though certain markets may have a primary first language, which may be local to them, there may be a second language that they're familiar with, in English, for example, but there may be a certain accent that they know means more prestigious or more luxury. For example, a lot of markets like to hear a British accent if they want to hear content in English over an American accent. If you're supplying a product or service online, there may be actually local tax and VAT implications that you need to think about. So what is their local tax rate or VAT rate that if they are a business buying that product or service, they could actually claim it back? What does that mean for your business supplying it as well locally to that market? And finally, there may be local compliance that you need to be aware of. So local privacy laws, if you think of Europe, there's GDPR. In Singapore, there's an e-privacy. in the US, there's a lot to do around healthcare versus consumer stuff. It's always good to understand those local laws. And the reason why this is quite interesting as well is with a lot of the laws and what you're allowed to say and what you're allowed to advertise, there may be things that you can't say or you can't do. And they may be platform regulations you need to follow based on country laws too. So for example, if you're advertising on Google Ads or Facebook, Meta, Instagram, there will be things that you need to be aware of if you're advertising in that local country, whether you're actually delivering your product or service in that country or whether you're just trying to target that country to come to another destination. Number 2, localization is a long-term investment. So if you are really serious about localization and wanting to enter a certain market, you really need to plan in advance and think about how you're actually going to go into that market. There are different ways of approaching this, okay? So you could be running certain campaigns or advertising or putting content in certain places to see the bite in that market. Okay, fine. Treat that then as part of your market research. But when you're actually serious about entering that market, and it may be physically or virtually because you're doing it online, you really need to plan in advance. And I would say you need to engage with local people or people that understand local culture. There's only so much AI can do, and even the likes of Google Translate. But really, if you want to keep that sentiment and make sure it's relatable to locals, you need a human involved with that. So you can do certain things with Google Translate, but then get a human to check it and make sure it makes sense. Again, I'll use the example of English is English, but in different countries, English words are spelt differently, they mean things, jokes are different. The same with Spanish, okay? So Spanish in South America versus Spanish in Spain, they can have completely different sentiments in how you say things. So as well as hiring local experts or engaging with local experts, understand local laws too. Because the last thing you want to do is actually come up stuck against local laws because you haven't understood it. Like I obviously mentioned, there are certain things that you may or may not be able to say or advertise or do. To give you another example, if you think of some of the movies that come out in the cinema, there are certain countries that actually remove certain scenes because that goes against their country laws or what they're allowed to actually show. And then there's also like content blocks in certain countries too. So you may be trying to advertise, but it may never be seen in certain countries. The reason why I'm saying you need to plan about localization is because there's so much to it. There's obviously, as I said, engaging with local experts to understand the sentiment and translation of your content or transcreation of your content, but then also how it looks, how you deliver it. Do you want to do dual language content? And then there's the whole other piece about your website and how you actually create your website experience. And if it's a different language, sometimes it's actually coded a different way. So for example, in Arabic, we read left to right and they read right to left. So there's lots of different things that you need to consider in how you actually deliver it and what that experience is like. And obviously once you're serious about localizing and you've got your plan in place and you've done your market research and you've got your expert, then the best thing to do as well is continue to test, adapt and learn. So be open to feedback and ask for feedback and engage with locals more so they can give you more feedback, so then you can adapt and optimize further in that market. As a wrap up, localization is more than just translating content. And if you really want to have your brand localized in certain markets, you need to build that trust with people. And so you need to make sure that you're giving them that recognition that you really understand them locally as a market and as a culture. Thank you for joining me for another episode of Engage and Thrive with your host Taelon, and see you next week.